Hi folks, my name is Linda Emmett and welcome to Happiness is an Inside Job. We are the creators of our own reality, we create our own lives. Our mind is our biggest limit and it's our own beliefs, behaviours and habits constantly caught in those cycles that keep us trapped where we are and stand in the way of our own happiness. So throughout this podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into some of those beliefs, habits and patterns, where they show up in your lives and what you can do to change them. Hi folks, and welcome aboard this week's podcast where we're going to take a dive into unprocessed grief. And this one at the moment and in the past few weeks has been very close to my heart and how I've been feeling. And I was just reading a line there that I thought I'd share with you because I think it's sometimes what we feel like when we're experiencing grief and sadness were in our system. And it's at times in life we can feel like our emotions are inside, threatening the very life they belong to. And what I mean by that and how I understand that, I suppose, is at times our emotions can feel so strong or so overwhelming or so deep, especially something we've repressed for decades. They nearly feel like they're threatening the life they belong to, they're threatening you, because when them emotions are upsurging, coming up in our system to be released, the fear that comes with that, our own fearful thoughts can nearly feel like those emotions are threatening the life they belong to, that you won't manage, that you can't manage, that something terrible will happen. And that causes us often to try to push them back down. But I genuinely believe our emotions present ourselves when our system knows that we're okay to heal, that we're ready to let go, or when we're asking a particular question and our own mind, our body, our system is giving us the answer. So I'm going to share a little story with you folks, and it's for me decades ago. And I remember very vividly waking up in the middle of the night in my grandparents' bed, and it was pitch dark out in the room, and I can still feel everything from that experience. I remember the pink electric blanket was just cooling down. Me nanny used to turn her on at an ungodly hour and you'd be roasting, but that was just cooling down, and it was tucked between the 10 other blankets that she had on the bed. It was a wrought iron bed that you could never sneak out of, because the bed made that much noise that they knew that you were sneaking out if you tried to sneak out. But I woke up on that particular night and I looked around the room and there was like blue flashing lights filling the room. So I walked over to the window, and it was me little PJs, me forever friend PJs that me nanny had bought me, because I remember walking on the plastic of them on the floor. And I looked out the window, and when I looked out I seen an ambulance at the end of the garden. And when I seen the ambulance, it had its back doors open, and I looked down at the porch. Sorry. And I seen my grandfather being carried out on a stretcher. I didn't know I'd get this emotion over even still, but it struck me when I looked down at him. All I remember thinking is he was in his white vest, with a blanket covering the bottom half of his body. And I remember thinking at the time, he is going to be so annoyed that he's seen outside without his crisp short, a starch collared short, and his lovely soft woolly jumpers that he wore. I remember thinking he would be so pissed about that he was seen outside in his vest. And what I didn't know at the time was he was already dead when they were carrying him out. And clearly, folks, I'm talking about unrepressed grief, and what you should probably tell from listening to me now is this is something I've repressed for decades. He was my bestie, my buddy. We did everything together. He was my my beacon of light. And for me, on that night, my whole world changed. Everything changed for me on that night. I never ever, it's only looking back now, I never shed a tear. I did not cry one time. But the loss of him and the shift that created in my life was huge. And it's only now that I'm working through the grief of it that yeah, I'm seeing the patterns that created. But when I experienced that loss, and I've experienced many losses since, folks, as we all have, I've experienced many deaths, many losses in different ways, but that particular one for me with him was beyond my system's capacity to cope at the time. It was, as a child, it was just beyond my capacity to cope, so I didn't. I literally subconsciously disassociated. For me, that wasn't happening. I played the next day. I went into the neighbours and I was minded in there. We got extra biscuits and chocolates, and I just completely disconnected from that altogether. And I truly do believe, folks, that when we're ready to heal from something, it presents itself at exactly the right moment. Is it easy? Absolutely not at times. But it's always a releasing and a letting go, always. And sometimes it's a release of buried pain, something we couldn't cope with or deal with at the time. Sometimes it's a release of the rage or the guilt that we're holding on from that, or the sadness or loss. But most of all, for us, a lot of the time, it's the release of the beliefs that created at that time, and the changes in our own core foundational beliefs that created. And for me, when he passed, the world itself just wasn't the same place. Everything changed when he died. Obviously, my nanny was struggling massively with grief and learning to manage herself in a world without him, financially, with the house, with everything. My mum had our own struggles with our mental health. That life changed. With him, he was like, we did everything, I spent my summers there, we got everything. And my own family, I tell you, I was the apple of his eye. He absolutely adored me, as did me grandmother. But I mean, like, we used to race in the park. We'd fish on his boat all day, and then bring the fish back to me nanny, and she'd make batter for it, and we'd have fish and chips. We'd go for drives. We'd race. He'd race me in the park and win. We did everything together. But like, above all else, it's what he was to me. He to me, he loved me, he heard me, he was my safe haven from everything else. He protected me, he was my safety. And I think when he passed, maybe I should have left this podcast for a couple of weeks, but I think that when he passed, the bottom fell out of my world so much that, as I mentioned, it was beyond my capacity to cope. So I just, as a child, my system did what it needed to do to survive, and I stuffed it all down. I repressed it all subconsciously. And it's only really this year that I've been asking different questions, folks, to be honest. Like, what I've been looking at this year is some of the relationships I've been in my life, and looking at my life and relationships and asking, well, why do I always choose that? Why, like, I'll always choose particular patterns, choose particular things. Maybe, someone who's not emotionally available, someone who's safe for me to be with, but not they're all deeply, deeply loved. Now, to say this, folks, isn't to say I haven't deeply loved in my life, because I have, absolutely. But who I chose and what I chose was some of what I've been looking at in my life. And that, obviously, in asking some of those questions and asking myself, has unearthed something that I've deeply buried within myself for decades. And it's through looking at the connections of feeling the two, because if you ask your mind a question, if you ask your own system what is going on or why these things are happening, it will show you. Now, it may show us in little slivers and we look back and go, oh, that's what that meant, that's what that was, and I'm doing that now. But it's when we're ready to sit, look and feel that we'll start putting the pieces together. And it's there that the real change lies. There that you can let go of the grief, the pain, the patterns that came from that feeling of not being safe. Because one of the things it created for me was I became ultra independent. I never really wanted to rely on anybody else in case they'd abandon me. I became the protector. I became the safe space, the all of those things. And in a lot of ways, when I was younger, I became those things in the hope that someone would do it for me. But the ultra independence, in another way, wouldn't allow anybody to do it for me. And then I'd wonder what was happening in some of my relationships. But I was literally in conflict with myself. I was seeking this out and looking for it in people, but in the same breath, not actually allowing anybody to be any of those things, because I couldn't allow it, because I couldn't feel that. I couldn't allow myself to be vulnerable to that again. And that left me in quite a bit of turmoil. And, you know, some of the choices I made were sabotaging. And it's only now when I'm looking at some of that I'm starting to realise where all those connections are. And I'm beginning to unearth how some of that shaped, and seeing even the ultra independence that I have let go of a bit of, but seeing how that is often a detriment to you. We're not born to be ultra independent, or as humans, we're not created to go it all alone, to be the absolute everything for ourselves. It stops us being vulnerable. Now, I'm not saying, as you know, folks, it's not like we need to have a good relationship with ourselves, a great relationship with ourselves, because that also dictates all the other relationships we choose. We choose from where we are. So ultra independence does not allow for that. Ultra independence is actually a trauma response. We're responding to, for me, the feeling of complete abandonment, the feeling of to love someone that deeply and that much, and for that to go, that to not experience that again. So that's one of the coping mechanisms that I built in. And it's only now in allowing myself feel that pain, feel that grief, allow that to come up, allow it to be okay for it to come up, and not fight with myself that, oh, that was decades ago, or oh, you sure, all of those things. Get out of judgment, realise it's something that I oppressed for years, because that's how unprocessed grief shows in our system. We kind of process it. It may not be like me where you haven't cried at all. It may be that you got through particular stages of it, but got stuck in a particular stage of the process, and that's holding you there, and you're stuck in the patterns coming from that. But it is allowing yourself, when your system is ready, it will show it to you. And as I mentioned, folks, as children, we've amazing coping mechanisms, and one of them is disassociation. It's for our very survival. We disassociate, and grief is one thing that we all have in common. Ain't none of us in this life, because we love, because we've an innate capacity to love, we will always experience grief in some form or another. And grief knows no time bounds, no time limits. We can experience grief straight after someone dies. We can experience it with the loss of a job, the loss of a child moving out, a dog, any of these things. Anything that matters to us can cause us to experience grief. And it's allowing ourselves and learning to parent ourselves through that, releasing it. It's when it remains stuck in our system, and we're repressing it or holding it on, because, you know, we feel guilty. we didn't do enough, we didn't show up enough, whatever it is, we were angry at that person for dying, because God forbid we feel angry. That is just, when we feel angry, it's not because you're a bad person, it's just because you miss them. It's just because you want one more glimpse, one more hug, one more smile. Any of those things, that's all it is. So it's showing yourself the compassion that when that person passed, you were the best version of yourself you possibly could be, managing what you were at the time, and allowing yourself to unearth those emotions. Look at that guilt and see what it is. Look at that anger, that rage, that upset, and allow yourself to work through those emotions, because that's all repressed grief is. That's all it is, but it's sitting in our system until we have the willingness, or we ask the questions to unearth it, to bring it up, to release it. And yeah, in the moment it can hurt us, but it doesn't measure up to the hurt it's causing when we're holding it in. The pain is there, and it's shown up in our day to day. All it wants is to be released and let go. And that's where true freedom lies for us, folks. When we lose someone, and when we miss them, it's sometimes just giving ourselves that closure. We may want to say, I'm sorry. We may want to hear, I'm sorry. As I mentioned, we may want to helplessly beg God or the universe to give us one more moment. We can become angry at God and blame him. And it's moving through the process, allowing ourselves to feel that. Allowing ourselves and giving ourselves that closure. Even if it's decades later, it's giving yourself, writing that letter, sharing those words, putting them down on paper, allowing yourself to cry. Like the stages of grief in itself, the very first one is denial. And I think that's where I would have been very much stuck for a long time. I denied it, then I disassociated from it. And that's denying that it has happened at all. The next one is anger. It's feeling, as I say, angry at God, the world, the person themselves, the hospital, wherever it is, the family. It's anger. It is anger. It's one of the stages of grief. It's perfectly natural and normal to feel it. It's allowing yourself to feel it and just managing yourself in healthy ways, soothing yourself, feeling what the anger is. You finding a way of voicing that, getting it out of your system, whether it's screaming into a pillow, whether it's writing in an angry letter, it's getting it out of your system to move through it. The next one is bargaining. We often bargain with God. I know I bargained with him for years, and then I told him I wasn't talking to him anymore. I did all of those things. It's bargaining with anybody. With anybody to get back what you had. It's bargaining with the world, bargaining with yourself. And it's just, as I mentioned, it's another stage of grief. Depression. That is just the sadness of the loss. Depression scares a lot of us because we tie it into, our mental health, and it's something we'll never come out of. Depression is repressed emotion. When we reach the depression stage of grief, it's when we're really feeling it, when we're feeling the sadness of the loss. And it's in the allowance of letting ourselves feel that we can begin to move through it, that we can start navigating a world without that person. We can start looking at the loss they created, the hole they left in their lives, and building that in for ourselves. If it's like me, it was, safety, protection, those things. It's building that for myself. It's building ways that I feel safe with myself. I feel protected with myself. I don't need to be ultra independent. That I can again allow people in different ways. I can break down the barriers that created and different things like that. And that's all it means to feel the depression. It's feeling the sadness. And the very last stage of grief is acceptance. Acceptance that the world is different without this person. But the energy of who they are is still here. The essence of who they are. You can still talk to them anytime you choose, just in different ways. And it's learning, again, to manage yourself and navigate the world without that person, and be what they were to you, to learn to be that for yourself, to learn to give that for yourself. Because otherwise we're using our behaviours to manage our grief, and it's coming out in our impulses, in our rage, in our, weight gain because we feel unprotected. It's coming out in all our behaviours, our self-harm, our hair pulling, or binging, drinking, any of these things. So learning to allow the unprocessed come up, to feel it, to release it and let it go. And above all else, folks, asking for help when you need it. Like when this came up for me, I spoke to so many family members. I spoke to them about what I was feeling, about what was coming up. I reached out for support straight away. And if this is a stage you're stuck in, or a place you're stuck in, it's doing the same for yourself. That's learning to parent yourself and allowing yourself to grieve, and validating that and backing yourself up. That helps you move through the process to a better, brighter place. So that's it for me for this week, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it and got some fabulous takeaways. And as always, I invite you to connect in with me across social media, or check me out on my website, www.yourgifttoyou.com, or email me, linda@yourgifttoyou.com, guys, because I'd love to hear from you, and any topics you'd like for us to talk about, or any more learnings that you want. And please remember, give me those reviews, because it keeps the podcast getting out there to more people. So chat to you very soon, guys. Bye bye.